A black CEO was tied to his chair during boarding as if he didn't belong there. 15 minutes later, he showed no mercy, and the entire crew learned exactly who they were dealing with. They tied the black CEO to his own chair during boarding, thinking he was just another passenger they could bully into silence. They didn't realize the man they restrained was the one person who never shows mercy to abuse. Subscribe, if you believe dignity always rises stronger than force. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. The voice cut through the soft hum of boarding chatter, sharp and authoritative. Elias Rennick had just placed his carry-on bag in the overhead bin of row 6 when the words halted him mid-motion. He turned calmly to face the speaker, a flight attendant in a tightly fitted uniform, posture stiff as iron. The man's name tag read Corvin Braille, and his expression carried the taut restraint of someone balancing on the edge of irritation, and something colder. Elias's tone remained measured. Is there a problem with the bag? It exceeds regulation parameters for carry-on sizing, Corvin replied, eyes hardening. His jaw clenched ever so slightly, as if his words were carrying more than a baggage concern. It needs to be checked. Elias glanced at the bag, then back at Corvin. It fits the standard dimensions. I travel frequently. This has never been an issue. Corvin stepped forward, closing the gap between them. I don't care how often you travel. You've been informed of protocol, and I expect cooperation. Passengers nearby paused mid-conversation, glancing up from their phones, their snacks, their travel novels. The atmosphere shifted, just slightly, like a barometer falling before a storm. A younger flight attendant, Darren Vale, appeared from the galley, sensing the escalation. Everything all right here? Darren asked, his voice softer, unsure. Corvin didn't even glance at him. Step back, Vale. I've got this. Elias remained composed, though he could feel the temperature of the moment rising. He looked at Darren briefly, registering uncertainty in the man's eyes, then back to Corvin. I'm not refusing protocol. I'm asking for clarity. Corvin leaned in, voice dropping low, intimate and venomous. Clarity isn't what you need, sir. Compliance is. It wasn't the words themselves, but the weight beneath them. The way Corvin's eyes lingered on Elias, not with professional annoyance but with personal contempt, that shifted something deeper. Elias's instincts fired like a silent alarm. This wasn't about a bag. It never was. Corvin turned to the cabin. Due to a repeated refusal to comply with crew instructions, this passenger will be restrained for the safety of the flight. A wave of confusion swept across the aisle. Murmurs began. Cell phones subtly tilted upward. Someone near row 8 began recording, barely above the seat back. Elias's face remained still, but inside, his thoughts moved fast and far. Every moment was a node in a larger pattern. He could protest, he could force the confrontation, but that would only feed the narrative being crafted around him, one he hadn't consented to, but understood intimately. No, the battlefield was being drawn, and he would not fight on someone else's terms. I'm not resisting, Elias said quietly, almost to himself, but I am remembering. Turn your hands around, Corvin barked. Elias complied. The zip ties were industrial, meant for rapid restraint, firm and unforgiving. Corvin yanked them tighter than necessary, the plastic burning into skin. Elias didn't flinch. The flight attendant then pulled a wide strap from the jump seat and fastened it across Elias's chest, securing him to the seat as if he were a volatile prisoner, not a professional in transit. Darren hovered nearby, visibly uncomfortable. Corvin, maybe this is too far. Step back. Corvin snapped again, not even turning. The violence wasn't physical yet, but it was in the air, in the tone, in the assumption of guilt woven into every movement. Elias scanned the cabin through the corners of his eyes. The overhead cameras, he noted their angle. Row 4's lens had full visibility of the restraint. The reflective galley panel behind Corvin would capture part of his posture. His actions Elias was not resisting. He was observing, not storing data in a cloud, but in memory, exact angles, tones, glances, movements. Corvin crouched slightly, leveling his face near Elias's. "You won't ruin this flight. Not today." Elias said nothing. His gaze dropped, not in surrender, but in calculation. He watched Corvin's feet step away. A passenger across the aisle, a businessman in a navy tie, looked between the restrained man and the retreating flight attendant, his face frozen in disbelief. What struck the passengers hardest wasn't Elias's silence. It was how little fear he showed. No raised voice, no pleading. Just a quiet authority that seemed deeply rooted, like he was letting something unfold rather than fighting it. Darren stood a few feet back now, his lips pressed into a line, his hands awkward at his sides. He seemed frozen between the urge to intervene and the fear of doing so. Did he do something violent? A passenger finally whispered to Darren. Darren hesitated. No. No. But by then, Corvin had already moved toward the cockpit, radio in hand, issuing statements in short, clipped code. The passengers glanced around, unsure of what had just occurred, but certain they had witnessed something deeply wrong. Elias sat perfectly still, wrists burning, chest tight under the restraint, but mind sharper than ever. He'd seen power abused before, but rarely with this much pretense. And he knew something else, a truth that would soon upend the entire situation. The man who believed he held authority had just created the conditions for his own undoing. Elias didn't need to shout or resist. He needed to remember, and he was already counting. The plane's doors thudded shut, and as the engines began to hum, Elias's final thought rose quietly above the mounting noise. He has no idea what he just triggered. The aircraft rumbled softly beneath them as it began taxiing toward the runway. The low vibration moved up through the floor, past the steel bolts of the seat mounts, and into the soles of Elias Rennick's polished shoes. He sat, wrists zip-tied tightly to the armrests of his seat, body cinched down with the crude firmness of someone treated not as a passenger, but as a liability. His fingers flexed subtly, brushing against the abrasive plastic restraints. Pain had already started to pulse through his wrists, but Elias showed nothing. His face remained calm, unreadable, like the surface of still water hiding currents beneath. Corvin Braille walked past with a slow, exaggerated confidence, his stride stiff with false dominance. Every motion, every glance thrown toward the passengers seemed to perform a show of control. In truth, Corvin was overcompensating. Elias watched closely, his sharp mind absorbing details like a trained analyst. The glint of the ceiling-mounted security camera above row 4, slightly tilted, the small red indicator blinking behind the galley curtain, reflecting softly against the metal door, and the way Corvin leaned to whisper to another attendant while pretending to check inventory. "Keep your eyes front," Corvin snapped without looking, sensing Elias's gaze. Elias didn't reply. He didn't have to. The power dynamic was already shifting. Around them, the cabin was caught in a strange tension, one that hovered between shock and silence. Passengers stole glances, many holding their phones low, pretending to scroll while quietly recording. A teenage boy 2 rows behind Elias had his phone resting against the seat in front of him, camera discreetly aimed down the aisle. Corvin had warned everyone about unauthorized recording. He even threatened to confiscate devices. But no one listened. Fear had begun to crack, and the truth was escaping, one pixel at a time. Elias leaned back into the seat slightly, subtly testing the pressure of the restraint. He shifted his shoulders, then rotated one wrist half a degree. The zip tie scraped his skin, but more importantly, it loosened by a single, imperceptible notch. He logged the reaction time. Corvin didn't notice. A voice came from the opposite side of the aisle. "Excuse me, this doesn't seem right." It was a young man, early 30s, dressed in a navy blazer and khaki slacks or entave. Elias had noticed him bored earlier, overly polite to the flight crew, careful with his briefcase. Corvin wheeled on him. "Sir, I've already explained this is a matter of in-flight security. You are not cleared to interfere." "He's tied up," Oren replied, voice firm but steady. "He's not even speaking. How is that a threat?" Corvin's jaw tensed. "I will not ask again. Sit down and remain silent." Oren hesitated, his mouth tightening, but he sat back down, defiant, though quiet. The moment passed, but not without leaving a mark. Elias watched the exchange unfold like a chess player tracking moves in a match. The moment someone else spoke up, Corvin flinched, not physically but in posture. It was subtle, but it confirmed what Elias suspected. Corvin's control wasn't real. It was borrowed power, and it was slipping. Then, without warning, the cabin dimmed for a beat, and the pilot's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an instrument sensor reading, we'll be returning to the gate briefly. We appreciate your patience." A soft, collective murmur rippled through the cabin. Elias tilted his head slightly, watching Corvin's shoulders stiffen. The news had caught him off guard. The timing wasn't part of his plan. Corvin turned abruptly and strode back toward Elias, kneeling with a clumsy urgency. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered, low enough that only Elias could hear. "You're staying exactly where you are." Elias didn't respond. His silence, his unshakable stillness, was beginning to have a new effect. Not compliance command. Corvin reached into his pocket and pulled out a second pair of zip ties. Without warning, he looped them around Elias's ankles. Tightening them to the chair's base frame with unnecessary force, plastic grated against bone. Several passengers audibly gasped. Oren rose halfway from his seat, but Corvin threw a glare so sharp it cut the air. "Sit down. Now." Oren obeyed. But the line had shifted. People weren't just uneasy anymore. They were watching, judging, remembering. Elias could see it in their eyes. The cabin wasn't siding with the uniform anymore. As the plane turned slowly on the tarmac and came to a full stop, a strange silence settled across the interior engines, hummed low. The lights flickered once, then returned to normal. The energy had changed, heavy, still, waiting. Corvin stood over Elias, chest rising and falling faster than before. He tried to look in control, but his breathing betrayed him. Elias spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice a quiet anchor that drew every ear closer. "This ends sooner than you think." Jalen Kors stepped onto Flight Valiant 617, just as the sterile air of the jet bridge sealed shut behind him. The silence that greeted him wasn't the ordinary hush of boarding. It was dense, coiled with something electric. Before his shoes could fully clear the threshold, a figure stormed toward him. "Supervisor Kors, thank you for coming," Corvin Braille said, voice raised and sharp. "Passenger in 4A initiated physical contact with crew. I had no choice but to restrain him, for the safety of everyone on board." Jalen's eyes flicked to the seat in question. What he saw didn't match the tone of the report. A tall, composed black man sat tied to his chair with industrial zip ties laced across his wrists and ankles, his posture unnervingly calm. He didn't fit the image of a threat. No flared nostrils, no clenched teeth, just stillness, like someone watching a puzzle solve itself in slow motion. "Sir, can you confirm what happened?" Jalen asked, stepping past Corvin, whose eyes darted with urgency. Elias Rennick's voice was quiet but unshakably clear. There was no aggression. "He asked me to place my carry-on in the cargo hold. I complied verbally. He escalated anyway." "He's lying," Corvin snapped, cutting him off. He raised his voice, was uncooperative. "That bag was flagged. I followed standard protocol." Jalen's brow twitched, not at Elias's calmness but at Corvin's insistence. "So you tied him down?" Corvin squared his shoulders. "Passenger was non-compliant. We're trained to neutralize threats swiftly." Before Jalen could respond, a murmur rose from row 5, then row 6. A man in a slate blazer, or in tave, seated by the window, spoke clearly. "That's not what happened. I saw it all. He never raised his voice." The flight attendant was the one who escalated. Another voice joined in from the opposite aisle. "I recorded it." Jalen turned to look at the growing sea of devices, phones gripped in trembling hands. Some already recording. Some paused on freeze frames showing Corvin's hands gripping Elias's arms. "You can check the boarding camera, too," Elias said, meeting Jalen's gaze. "It has audio. The mic on the doorframe was live." Corvin's face twitched. A bead of sweat traced a slow path from his temple to his jawline. Jalen's eyes narrowed. "The boarding door camera? That's not accessible to—" "It is, if you're cleared to see protocol violations," Elias replied steadily. "Ask Operations Control. The logs are time-coded." Corvin stepped in again, louder this time. "Supervisor, with respect, he's manipulating the narrative." But Jalen wasn't listening to him anymore. He was watching the other attendant, Darren Vale, who had stepped forward and now hovered hesitantly behind Corvin. "Darren," Jalen said sharply, "is there anything you'd like to say?" Darren opened his mouth but faltered. His eyes darted to Corvin, then back to Elias, whose calm presence didn't seem like an act. He swallowed. I didn't hear him threaten anyone. He asked why the bag was a problem. That's all. I tried to de-escalate." Corvin's elbow shot backward, not hard, but enough to bump Darren out of the conversation. The act didn't go unnoticed. Jalen flinched. So did the passengers. "Are you serious?" someone muttered from row 7. "He just shoved him." "You still think he's the threat?" another passenger whispered, voice laced with disbelief. Jalen's hand moved to his earpiece. "Ops Control, this is Cores on 617 request immediate access to boarding cam logs. Passenger in 4A requests audit of interaction." Before the voice on the other end could respond, Corvin stepped in front of Jalen, blocking the aisle. "No need to escalate," Corvin said, smile tight, voice brittle. "We're already stabilizing the situation." "Step aside," Jalen ordered, tension sharpening in his voice. "You're letting a passenger dictate flight operations. Step aside." Corvin hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elias saw it. Not defiance fear, not the fear of being wrong, but the fear of being found. Jalen pushed past, but Elias's voice, calm as stone in deep water, stopped Corvin cold. "You're not afraid of me," Elias said. "You're afraid of what they'll find." "Operations. This is Jalen Cores requesting immediate verification on a crew assignment Flight 617, front section." The radio crackled faintly in Jalen's hand as he stood near the cockpit door, his voice low but firm. He kept his gaze fixed on Corvin Braille, who stood frozen mid-aisle, jaw clenched, arms rigid by his sides. Around them, the tension in the cabin had thickened into something almost physical, as if every breath taken was shared between 50 uneasy lungs. The passengers, once murmuring in confusion, were now focused with razor-like clarity. They had seen enough. They knew something was wrong, and Elias Rennick had given them reason to trust their instincts. Corvin's eyes darted, calculating, but the calculations came slower now. He had underestimated the stillness of the man he restrained, and now he was beginning to see that stillness not as submission, but as warning. "I'm not the only one seeing this, right?" One of the passengers, a young man in glasses seated in row 6, finally spoke up. "He didn't do anything. I watched the whole thing. That guy," he pointed at Corvin, "just snapped on him before we even took off." "Me too," added another voice, this time deeper, from a middle-aged man near the emergency exit. "Said his bag was too large, then jumped straight to secure the passenger. That's not protocol. That's personal." Elias didn't move. He didn't need to. The passengers were becoming his voice. Corvin turned on them, the edges of his composure fraying. "You weren't trained to interpret threats," he snapped, though his tone lacked the command it once held. "You don't understand the security protocols I'm following." Jalen raised a hand. "Then explain them," he said, measured but with a quiet authority, "because from where I'm standing, you're the only crew member acting out of line." Darren Vale, standing a little too close to the galley wall like he wished it would swallow him whole, suddenly exhaled. His voice was small but trembling with something close to guilt. "Corven made me switch sections before boarding," he said. "Said he needed to be stationed up front, for a specific passenger." Corven's head snapped toward him, the fury behind his eyes barely contained. "Shut your mouth, Vale." But the words had already landed. Elias's eyes narrowed as he locked onto Corven's ID badge. A detail. He had missed it earlier, but not anymore. Near the lower edge of the laminated plastic, beneath the barcode and the standard airline insignia, was an emblem, barely visible but unmistakable to a trained eye. A stylized N, interwoven with an arrowhead-like triangle. It wasn't from Valion Air. It belonged to a private contractor. Elias's mind sharpened. The emblem belonged to an independent behavioral operations firm, a group known in limited corporate security circles for embedding their personnel into civilian spaces, allegedly to monitor executive behaviors under stress. Their existence had been whispered about, never confirmed. But that mark changed everything. "You knew who I was before I boarded," Elias said, his voice level. The entire cabin turned toward him. "Didn't you, Corven?" Corven hesitated, just enough for the silence to sting. "That's a serious claim," Jalen said, his face hardening. "If it's true, you had prior knowledge of this passenger's identity without a formal manifest note. That's a breach." Corven took a step back. "This is manipulation," he barked. "He's spinning this. He wants to control the narrative." Elias leaned forward against the restraint slightly, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Then prove it. Let operations confirm who cleared your placement on this flight." Corven flinched. For a man who had restrained another so confidently, he now looked remarkably unsteady. The radio on Jalen's vest crackled again. He turned slightly to listen, nodding as he jotted something on a small notepad. When he turned back, he was frowning. "They're checking," Jalen said, "but the terminology they used, clearance by request, that's not a phrase I've seen before." Elias met Jalen's eyes. "Because it isn't standard, it's code." Corven's breathing grew shallow, chest rising and falling faster. "You want to explain what that phrase means, Mr. Braille?" Jalen asked quietly. Stepping closer, Corven's fingers twitched. He looked ready to bolt, but there was nowhere to go. "The badge," Elias said, tilting his head toward Corven's chest. "That mark? That doesn't belong to Valion. It belongs to a private firm, one that shouldn't have access to commercial crew schedules." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then another passenger, an older man with salt and pepper hair, leaned out from his seat and said, "So you were planted. This was never about protocol." "Operations can confirm it," Elias added. "Ask who signed the crew manifest. Ask who logged him into the flight roster." Corven backed away, one step, then two. His hand gripped the edge of the service cart for support. "Sir," Jalen said, voice tighter now, "I need you to stand still while I finish this verification." "I don't have to answer to you," Corven hissed, panic leaking into his voice. "You do," Jalen replied, calm but authoritative. "If you're not who you say you are." Passengers exchanged tense glances. Darren had gone pale, still pressed against the galley wall, as if replaying every instruction Corven gave him with new clarity. The illusion of authority was gone now. In its place was a man unraveling, trembling hands, darting eyes, cracking voice. Elias straightened in his seat, the zip ties creaking softly under the shift of weight. He studied Corven with quiet clarity. No gloating, no anger, only a sense of inevitability. The truth was closing in. And then, in a voice calm enough to silence the entire cabin, Elias delivered the words that turned Corven's panic into something closer to dread. "They put you here for a reason, and you already failed it." Operations Control just responded, Jalen Kors said, his voice tight with confusion as he lowered the comm to his side. They said Corvin was assigned by clearance request. The words hung awkwardly in the cabin air like smoke refusing to clear. Elias Rennick, still restrained but never more mentally alert, lifted his head slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in recognition. That phrase was no accident. It wasn't in any standard crew assignment protocol. It wasn't even internal jargon. It was camouflage, language used by third-party operatives embedded into corporate systems through backdoor authorization. It meant someone had manipulated the records. Corvin Braille shifted his weight immediately, just a step, but Elias caught it. Not fear, instinct. A predator caught before the pounce. "What does that even mean?" one of the passengers muttered from row 7. "It means," Elias replied, voice cool and clear despite his position, "that someone bypassed regular crew scheduling." Corvin scoffed loudly and stepped forward. "This is absurd. He's trying to twist everything. He's not even supposed to be—" "No," Elias cut in, gaze unmoving. "The real question is, were you?" Jalen blinked. "What?" "Pull the crew manifest," Elias said calmly, "with signature logs. Now." Corvin's jaw clenched, and for the first time since boarding, his eyes darted, left, right, then toward the rear galley. It was only for a second, but Elias saw it. He followed Corvin's line of sight and locked in on the storage compartment door behind the coffee unit. The attendant had been avoiding it all flight, pretending it didn't exist. Jalen hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, the pressure of command. He turned, pulled out the flight tablet from the equipment drawer beneath the jump seat, and tapped into the manifest. Darren Vale, the quieter of the attendants, took a cautious step backward. Corvin's head snapped toward him. "Don't move," Corvin hissed under his breath, low enough that only Elias in the nearest row could hear. The aggression in his voice was no longer coated in professionalism. It was raw and desperate. "Darren," Elias said evenly, "you don't need to be a part of this." Darren hesitated, looked at Elias, then at Corvin, and took another step back. Corvin spun toward the aisle. "He's trying to sow division," he barked, his voice cracking. "This man has been manipulating everyone since he stepped on board." But no one moved. If anything, passengers leaned away from Corvin, instinctively creating a wide arc of space around him. A few passengers stood slowly, forming a barrier between him and Elias. One man in his early 30s, dressed in business attire, folded his arms and planted his feet. "You've done enough," he said softly. Jalen's voice broke the rising quiet. "Something's wrong," he said. His thumb hovered over the manifest screen. Then he looked up, brows furrowed. "Corvin, your name's here, but it's not signed. There's no official timestamp, just an empty clearance code." "What?" Corvin said, eyes wide. "No initials, no supervisor approval, no electronic signature," Jalen added, showing the tablet. Elias stared straight at Corvin. "He wasn't scheduled. He was inserted." "Lies!" Corvin roared. "He's spinning this into—" "Stop!" Jalen ordered sharply. "You're not helping yourself." Corvin's breathing grew ragged. He stepped forward toward Jalen, toward the tablet. "Let me see that." "No," Jalen said, pulling it back. Corvin lunged. The passengers tensed, but a tall man from row 3 reached out and placed a firm hand on Corvin's shoulder, holding him back without aggression. "Don't," the man said simply. "This ends now." Corvin froze in place, one arm half raised. He stared at the tablet as if it were a weapon trained directly on him. Jalen slowly turned the screen, showing it to the cabin. The blank entry glowed beneath Corvin's name like a spotlight on stage. His silence now was louder than anything he'd said. All flight, Elias watched the moment shift, the fault line cracking wide. He lifted his chin, not in defiance but in declaration. He looked Corvin dead in the eye and spoke with steady force, his voice the final blade of truth. "Your name was never meant to be on this flight." The air snapped tense as Jalen Core's voice cut through the silence, each syllable of the flight manifest's discrepancy slicing deeper than the last. "There's no assignment signature here," he said, staring at his tablet. "Just a blank approval code." That phrase alone cracked whatever thin shell of authority Corvin Braille had been clinging to. Corvin's entire demeanor shifted. His jaw tensed, hands balled into trembling fists. That's not possible," he blurted out, voice wavering. He stepped back from Jalen like the tablet was a weapon, like the truth had physically struck him. His eyes darted around the cabin, seeking control he no longer possessed. The passengers, once silent with uncertainty, were now alert, sensing something deeply wrong. Then, without warning, Corvin turned and stormed toward the galley. "Sir, step back now," Jalen barked, lifting a hand instinctively. But Corvin didn't stop. "You want protocol?" he shouted, voice cracking as he reached for the galley latch. "I'll show you protocol breaches." His movements were no longer calculated. They were erratic, unstable, the unraveling of a man who had counted on secrecy and now found himself naked before witnesses. Elias Rennick, still bound to his seat, watched everything with razor clarity. The industrial zip ties cut into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. Pain was irrelevant. Observation was everything. Each detail was a thread, and Corvin had just yanked the entire weave loose. Jalen moved forward. "You need to step away from the storage area. Now." But Corvin's hand had already gripped the compartment latch. That hesitation from earlier, Elias remembered it now. When Corvin passed this compartment twice without so much as a glance, it was deliberate, fear-based. Avoidance had meaning, and now he was running straight to it. "Wait," Elias said, voice calm but piercing. "Let him open it." Jalen froze. So did half the cabin. Corvin yanked the latch upward with a metallic snap. Gasps rippled through the aisle as the compartment door creaked open. Inside wasn't luggage. It wasn't cabin supplies. It wasn't even a mistake. It was a sealed envelope, thick, wax-stamped, pristine, resting dead center like a bomb made of paper and silence. The emblem stamped across its face was unmistakable. Even from a distance, Elias recognized the symbol, two intersecting lines inside a triangular ring, clean, cold, and illegal. The same mark shimmered faintly on the corner of Corvin's badge. Corvin staggered back, his mouth hanging open. The color drained from his face, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. Jalen stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the envelope. "What is that?" Corvin didn't answer. He stared like the object was glowing. Elias's voice cut through again, even as he sat bound. "That symbol belongs to Nextral operatives," he said, tone level but commanding. "They were disbanded years ago after being caught infiltrating private boardrooms they rebranded. But their methods didn't change." "You don't know what you're talking about," Corvin barked, spinning around. "He's lying. He's dangerous." The words came too fast, too loud. The panic betrayed him. "No," Elias replied softly. "The only danger here is how badly you underestimated exposure." Jalen stepped back slightly, his radio clicking on as he contacted airport security. His voice was tense but controlled. "This is Coors on 617. We need security at the aircraft. Possible breach of assignment protocol and possible placement of unauthorized material on board." Corvin's breaths turned erratic. He looked at the passengers, dozens of eyes watching him, none sympathetic. His hands trembled as he backed toward the aisle wall. He met Elias's eyes, and for the first time, the balance of power was unmistakable. Elias, though restrained, was completely composed. Corvin, though unbound, was collapsing. "You think this proves anything?" Corvin snapped. "It's just paper." Elias tilted his head slightly. "No, it's motive, planted, positioned, then hidden, until your panic gave it away." "You don't know who I am." "I know exactly what you are," Elias replied, "an observer, embedded without clearance, directed to watch, not for safety, but for sabotage. "Enough!" Corvin shouted, fists shaking. "You don't get to turn this around. You're not supposed to—" "Think," Elias interrupted gently. "You made one mistake, Corvin. You thought I'd fight back. You thought that would validate your lie." The entire cabin had gone silent again. Even the air-conditioning hum felt distant. Darren Vale, pale and visibly shaken, stepped forward, voice trembling. He told me before boarding that he needed to access the galley, said he had materials to secure privately. I didn't ask questions. I just thought—" "You just followed orders," Elias finished for him. "But he wasn't here to serve. He was here to stage." Corvin turned his back toward the galley, leaning against the panel like it could hold him up. The panic that had been simmering beneath his performance finally breached the surface. Elias leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed, his voice low and calm, but the most dangerous thing in the cabin. "You weren't sent to control me. You were sent to observe me." The shift was immediate, raw, reckless, and completely untethered from the rigid control he had clung to since the boarding gate. His eyes widened with panic, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts as he lunged forward, slicing through the air like a predator in retreat disguised as attack. "Permission to escalate restraint," he barked, voice cracking at the edges. But Jalen stood firm just beyond the aisle, arm half raised in instinctive denial, his face a portrait of disbelief and growing alarm. "No," Jalen replied sharply. "Stand down, Corvin." But Corvin didn't hear him, or chose not to. The cabin erupted into shouts as passengers recoiled in their seats. Some yelled for Corvin to stop. Others raised their phones again, trembling slightly, documenting every second as if the truth depended on their lenses. Darren moved to intercept, planting himself in Corvin's path. "That's enough, Corvin," he said, but the words barely landed before Corvin shoved him aside with an elbow to the ribs. Darren staggered into the seats, a low grunt escaping as he caught himself on an armrest, eyes wide in hurt and disbelief. Elias did not move. He didn't need to. He had already counted the seconds it would take Corvin to lose control. Already felt the pressure in his wrist shift as he slowly rotated against the plastic bindings during the previous 20 minutes. Already watched Corvin's tightening fear ripen into the kind of irrational aggression that marked a man who no longer knew the difference between power and panic. Corvin dropped low, reaching for the restraint strap tucked beside Elias's seat, a black tether meant to stretch across the passenger's chest during severe turbulence. But in Corvin's hands, it became a last weapon. The strap snapped out in his grip like a viper. Elias tensed, not from fear, but from calculation. He allowed his body to sway with Corvin's momentum as the strap pulled taut across his chest. His breath shallowed, spine straightened. Corvin leaned in, too close, muttering through gritted teeth, "This ends now." But it didn't. With a single invisible move, Elias twisted his right wrist down, pressing against the inner curve of his thigh where he had been working the plastic with micro-movements, aided by the friction of fabric. The zip tie slipped, caught once, then gave way. Corvin's hand froze. Passengers gasped in unison as Elias's wrist slid free. The broken tie dropped silently into his lap, barely visible to anyone but Corvin. The silence that followed was total. Jalen's voice cut through it like a blade. "Corvin, back away, now." Corvin didn't move. His mouth hung open slightly, 1,000 unspoken words dying in his throat as his eyes dropped to the free wrist, then jerked back up in disbelief. "You," he whispered, breathless. Elias rose. The motion was unhurried. His body unfolded from the chair with the poise of a man long denied movement but never agency. His shoulders rolled back, his jaw held in stillness. His hands, one still bound and one now free, hung at his sides like anchors, deliberate, visible, harmless in appearance but devastating in implication. Red marks banded his skin, fresh and raw, the quiet evidence of what he had endured without resistance. Corvin stumbled backward 2 steps, bumping into a seat frame. He looked around, seeking an ally, a path, anything that might validate what was quickly slipping beyond his grasp. No one moved, no one spoke for him. Even Darren remained rooted behind a seat, eyes fixed on Elias as if witnessing something inevitable. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. Elias took a single step forward. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't loud, but it commanded the air around it. With each inch of movement, he reclaimed space not just in the aisle, but in the truth itself. The man who had been treated as a threat now stood as the one who posed the greatest threat to falsehood. Corvin's voice cracked as he turned to Jalen, desperation pouring out like a final plea. You have to contain him. He's out of control." But Jalen didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Elias stopped, his body now casting a long shadow down the aisle. He stood just within reach of Corvin, though he made no move to touch him. His expression was composed, his breath even. He tilted his head slightly, not in challenge but in pity, as if seeing through Corvin for the very first time. Then, with a voice both low and thunderous, he delivered the sentence that brought the storm full circle. "Now we proceed on my terms." They tightened the straps, laughing under their breath, convinced he couldn't fight back. They never noticed the calm in his eyes, the kind that comes from someone who's already decided how this ends. If you believe arrogance collapses the moment truth stands up, hit subscribe now, because justice doesn't shake, it prepares. Corvin's hand twitched near the edge of the galley wall as Elias took one silent, deliberate step forward. The cabin fell still. Passengers froze mid-breath. The overhead lights reflected gently off the metallic trim of the aisle, but nothing moved except the faint sway of the aircraft mid-air, and Elias Rennick, finally standing, no longer bound. His posture was upright, hands lifted slightly at chest level, open and empty. The marks from the zip ties burned across his wrists, but his gaze remained calm, focused not on pain, but on purpose. "I'm not here to retaliate," Elias said, voice even, "only to clarify what just happened and why." Corvin Braille backed away slowly, the authority he once clutched now slipping like sand through fingers. His shirt clung to him with sweat, collar creased, jaw twitching as if trying to summon outrage he no longer had the breath for. "You heard him threaten me," Corvin barked, eyes wide, shifting toward Jalen Kors. Jalen raised a hand instinctively to calm the air. "No one's threatening anyone. Let him speak." "He's manipulating you," Corvin snapped, voice cracking like a glass under pressure. "This man was restrained for non-compliance. You saw the zip ties." A passenger called from the aisle. "We also saw you fake half the story." Another voice added, "Let him talk. He hasn't even raised his voice." Corvin's eyes darted to the left, to the right. He was surrounded, and he knew it. Elias turned slightly, addressing not Corvin, but the cabin. "From the beginning," he began, "this situation was engineered, not improvised. The restraint, not necessary. The manifest, altered. The badge?" He paused, raising a hand slightly toward the emblem on Corvin's chest. "It's not standard issue." Corvin opened his mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. His lips moved in silence and then closed. "This wasn't an incident," Elias continued, stepping slowly into the center of the aisle. "It was a test, a frame-up designed to produce a specific outcome, false aggression, passenger escalation, a narrative ready to deploy at the slightest provocation." Jalen furrowed his brow, visibly absorbing each word, as if the puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place. "I run Aeronaut Systems," Elias said clearly, eyes locking with his. "And, for weeks, we've been targeted. Anonymous surveillance signals. Interference in our security architecture. We believed it was digital, until now." Gasps stirred among the passengers. Several turned toward each other, some whispering, others filming again. Corvin took one halting step backward. "He's lying," he muttered. "This is reverse manipulation. He wants sympathy." "No," Elias said. "I want truth." And here's the final piece. My company's most sensitive proposals were finalized just hours before this flight. They're stored in a sealed drive in my possession. Coincidentally, this flight just happened to include a crew member with an unregistered assignment, a falsified roster, and a planted envelope with an emblem belonging to a surveillance contractor. Corvin's breath grew uneven. I didn't plant anything, he snapped. I followed procedure. You followed a script, Elias said softly, but it collapsed the moment you panicked. Corvin's panic erupted like a kettle bursting steam. He darted down the aisle toward the exit, shoulder clipping a row of seats. But he didn't get far. 2 passengers rose from their seats, stepping into the aisle, blocking him wordlessly. One of them crossed his arms. The other simply shook his head. You're not going anywhere, one said. Corvin turned, helpless. Elias stayed where he was, not chasing, not commanding, just allowing truth to do what force never could. I was never your real target, Elias said to him across the cabin. What I carry, what I represent, that was the target. You were sent here to fabricate a crisis and discredit it before it could surface. The plane felt like it was holding its breath. Corvin staggered back into a seat near the galley, lowering himself as if the floor beneath him no longer supported his spine. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. The silence did all the exposing he couldn't prevent. Elias stepped back, giving him space but not yielding his voice. I'll say nothing more, he said, eyes scanning the stunned faces across the aisle. I believe everything that needs to be said just has. Then he turned back toward Corvin, voice low, controlled, but final. A line that struck not through volume, but precision, one that would echo across every account, every retelling of the event, and seal Corvin's place in it forever. Your assignment ended the moment you tied me to that chair. Airport security stepped onto the aircraft, their boots thudding lightly on the carpeted floor of the cabin. But instead of a chaotic struggle, they were met with an unexpected sight. Corvin Braille, the man they had been told was the lead flight attendant, hunched in a seat near the galley, his face pale, his uniform wrinkled with panic. He looked nothing like someone in command. The officers hesitated for a second, confused by the lack of visible conflict. There was no shouting, no flailing passenger, no danger as described in the preliminary call. Just a strangely quiet man curled into himself, while further down the aisle, a calm black man stood upright with red marks across his wrists. Jalen Kors stepped forward quickly, his voice low but firm. That's him, he said, gesturing to Corvin. He's the one who restrained Mr. Rennick. It wasn't protocol. It was something else entirely. One of the officers, a tall man with a gray buzz cut and a sharp eye for body language, glanced at Elias. The passengers stood surrounded by fellow travelers, none showing fear, only something closer to quiet admiration. The man's clothes were neat, his breathing steady, his posture like a stone pillar planted in the middle of a storm. The officer saw the marks on Elias's arms and the faint redness where the zip ties had once bit into skin. Are you all right, sir? The officer asked. Elias nodded once. I am. But the evidence that matters is in that compartment, he said, pointing without raising his voice. And on his badge. The officers exchanged a look before stepping toward Corvin. At the sight of their approach, Corvin jerked up, stumbling to his feet. Arrest him, he shouted, pointing wildly toward Elias. He's the one. He threatened me. I followed regulations. His voice cracked as the accusation left his mouth, his composure unraveling in full view of the cabin. The moment was too far gone. The illusion of control was shattered, and the officers didn't even glance toward Elias as they moved in on Corvin. Sir, we need you to calm down, the lead officer said, extending an arm as Corvin began backing away. Corvin made one last, feeble attempt to push past the aisle, but his foot caught on the corner of a seat. His body twisted as he lost balance and he collapsed into the officer's arms, gasping like someone drowning in panic. Elias stepped aside without a word, giving them space as they cuffed Corvin with efficient professionalism. One of the officers lifted the badge from Corvin's chest, inspecting the strange emblem on its corner. His eyes narrowed. This symbol, seen it before, he muttered to himself. Elias didn't smile, didn't flinch. He simply stepped closer and said, "The envelope he tried to hide. It's marked with the same insignia. Please preserve it intact. Any tampering will affect the chain of truth." The officer nodded, now clearly recognizing that Elias wasn't simply a victim. He carried himself with poise and quiet command, like someone used to giving orders in boardrooms far more intimidating than this cabin. As the security team guided Corvin toward the exit, the entire plane seemed to exhale. The pressure that had built with each minute of uncertainty, conflict, and confusion finally began to lift. Passengers erupted into soft applause, not raucous or mocking, but relieved, grateful, not just for Corvin's removal, but for the way Elias had handled it all with restraint, with dignity. Darren Vale, standing near the beverage cart, looked ashamed as he stepped closer. His face was pale, his eyes filled with regret. "Mr. Rennick," he said softly, I should have spoken sooner. I should have stopped him earlier. I'm sorry." Elias turned to him with a calm, almost paternal look. "You did speak, when it mattered," he said. "Courage is not the absence of delay. It's the presence of action when delay no longer serves." The younger man swallowed, nodding gratefully. Jalen came next, shoulders square but clearly humbled. He placed a hand over his chest, a silent gesture of accountability. "I failed to act fast enough," Jalen said. "I let the situation evolve too far. You have my full apology." Elias regarded him carefully, then extended his hand, not out of forgiveness, but as a quiet offering of respect. "Accepting fault is the first step to preventing its repeat," Elias said. "That matters more than timing." They shook once, firm and brief. Jalen looked genuinely moved. The aircraft cabin now felt reset, cleansed of its earlier tension. People returned to their seats slowly, whispering in soft tones. Some looked at Elias like they had just watched a man endure a storm without flinching. Others looked at him like he might be someone far more important than they'd initially assumed. Elias sat down again, not in restraint this time, but with absolute freedom. His wrists were red, the marks still fresh, but he didn't hide them. He folded his hands calmly in his lap and looked forward, eyes focused yet distant, his mind already stepping beyond the scene. Because he knew what came next wouldn't be as public, but it would be far more consequential. He turned his head slightly toward the open cabin door, watching as the officers vanished down the jet bridge with Corvin between them. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of everything left unspoken. We're only halfway through the truth. Commander Relin Vore stepped onto the jet bridge with the posture of a man used to resolving chaos, but even he hadn't anticipated the storm waiting behind the aircraft door. The narrow corridor buzzed with tension, not from noise, but from a heavy, restrained silence. Elias Rennick stood at its center like a sculpted pillar of calm, his hands folded behind his back, eyes locked on the small evidence bag in Relin's gloved hand. Inside the transparent plastic sleeve was the sealed envelope pulled from the galley compartment, marked with the unauthorized emblem that had detonated the entire operation. The symbol, a crescent embedded within a broken triangle, sent a shiver down Relin's spine. It wasn't just the mark of an obscure contractor, it was a relic from intelligence files most security heads preferred to forget. "Where did you say this was found?" Relin asked, holding the bag slightly higher under the jet bridge's overhead light. "In the upper galley storage," Elias replied, his voice precise, steady, "directly beneath where your operative was posted, or rather, where he posted himself." Relin frowned, glancing down at the bag again. "I haven't seen this emblem in years," he muttered, "and it was never supposed to resurface." Elias didn't flinch. "It tends to appear when silence becomes more valuable than truth." Relin studied him closely now, noticing how unshaken Elias remained, how he seemed to carry not just poise, but a familiarity with threat. You knew what it was the moment you saw it, Relin said slowly. This isn't your first encounter. No, Elias said. It isn't. Outside, through the windows along the jet bridge, passengers were being guided back into the terminal under the supervision of red-vested airline personnel and plainclothes security. Each of them looked rattled, but none hostile. Every few moments one would glance back at the aircraft, not in fear, but with quiet awe, as if they had seen something that didn't belong in a commercial cabin. Inside the aircraft, only silence remained. Relin stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you want to explain how you identified the symbol so quickly? Elias paused before answering, giving the commander just enough space to wonder if he was overreaching. Because the last time they tried, Elias said, they didn't plant an envelope. They planted a story, one designed to collapse my credibility. They failed then, too. A flicker of unease crossed Relin's face. He looked down again at the bag, now feeling the envelope's weight not in grams, but in implications. This wasn't random, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Elias turned, facing the aircraft door. No, it wasn't. A moment passed before Relin pulled out his notepad, scribbling a few rapid lines. Corven's being processed, he said. He's refusing to speak. Won't say a word except, I was given orders. That's it, over and over. Elias didn't blink. I expected that. The way he said it unsettled Relin, not because of arrogance, but because it sounded like preparation, like someone who had already planned 6 moves beyond this point. We're collecting passenger statements, Relin continued, scanning his notes. Everyone confirms you were calm, that you complied, that the incident escalated without provocation. That's because I calculated the outcome before responding, Elias said, and you're not going to tell me how you knew it would happen? I'll tell you what matters, Elias replied. This wasn't about physical intimidation, it was about narrative construction. Corvin's role was to create an incident, one that could be clipped, edited, and sent to media with just enough ambiguity to raise questions. My silence? My calm? That didn't fit their script. Relin slowly exhaled, beginning to grasp the scale of what had been attempted. They weren't trying to hurt you. They were trying to frame you. Exactly, Elias nodded. The envelope wasn't for me. It was for the investigation they hoped would follow after I was removed mid-flight. From inside the aircraft, a technician passed silently, running final checks. The lights dimmed slightly, then reset. Elias glanced toward the empty cabin, where the echoes of the earlier confrontation seemed to still hang in the air. Jalen emerged from the aircraft's side corridor, his expression heavy with apology. All interviews are underway, he said, and, I'm sorry, Mr. Rennick, I truly am. Elias studied the man, noting his sincerity. You did what you could when it counted, he said. Courage isn't loud. It's timely. The flight officer bowed his head slightly, then stepped aside. Relin watched Elias for a moment longer, then spoke again, his tone more personal. Most people, when restrained like that, they panic. They shout you didn't. Why? Elias looked straight into his eyes. Because panic doesn't expose corruption. Patience does. The commander said nothing for a while, then he extended his hand. Elias shook it firmly. I'll make sure the envelope is sealed, stored, and untouched until the federal team arrives, Relin said, and I'll log every chain of custody entry myself. Good, Elias said, because the real target wasn't me. It was the proof I carry. They stood for a moment in the narrowed corridor of the jet bridge, the air cool, the silence pressing. A low rumble echoed through the floor, another plane taxiing nearby, but for the 2 men, everything felt suspended. Relin finally broke the stillness. Is there anything else I should know before you reboard? Elias paused, eyes narrowing slightly as he surveyed the cabin behind him. Only this, he said quietly. Whoever sent him will not enjoy what comes next. The moment Elias sat back down, it was different. No zip ties, no pressure on his wrists, no sense of being watched, at least not openly. The plane had been cleansed of its rot, or so it seemed, and now a fresh crew moved efficiently through the aisle, unaware of the storm that had passed just before their arrival. Yet, despite the illusion of calm, Elias felt the hum of tension beneath the surface, like static under the skin. The passengers reboarding the flight moved with quiet urgency, eyes flicking toward Elias with reverence and curiosity. They whispered to one another, nodding in his direction like he was something more than a man. He ignored it, not out of pride, but because his focus was elsewhere. As he buckled his seatbelt, his fingers brushed something foreign, something that hadn't been there before. A folded note. His breath caught for half a second, just enough to shift the rhythm of his pulse. He glanced around. The new crew was busy with pre-flight routines. Jalen stood near the front giving final instructions to the lead attendant, his face drawn but respectful. Elias kept his face still, his movements casual, as he slipped the note into his palm and opened it beneath the tray table. The handwriting was rushed, slanted, male, and unmistakably urgent. They weren't after you. They were after what you carry. Elias didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared at the words as a wave of understanding broke through his thoughts like a silent breach in the hull of a ship. Not after him. After what he carried. Slowly, he unfastened the slim briefcase from beneath his seat and checked the biometric lock. Still intact, he opened it just enough to verify that the contents, his prototype drive, remained untouched. The secure device was a condensed core module containing confidential aeronautics algorithms designed to reshape how aircraft identified and neutralized airborne threats in real-time revolutionary tech. Dangerous in the wrong hands. Now he understood. The entire incident, the confrontation, the restraints, the planted envelope, even Corvin's erratic aggression, hadn't been about him as a person, it had been about discrediting him. Framing him, creating a false incident to cast doubt on his credibility and disable the very technology Aeronax was preparing to unveil. They weren't trying to harm him physically. They were trying to destroy the launch before it began. His fingers closed around the drive in his inner coat pocket. It was still warm against his chest. Still safe. But for how long? Across the aisle, a teenage boy peeked over the seat, wide-eyed, then quickly ducked away when Elias met his gaze. There was no hostility in the look, just curiosity, maybe even admiration. Elias exhaled quietly and sat back, his mind already dissecting the implications. This was a setup. Someone had planted the envelope not as a tool of observation, but of implication. A narrative had been constructed, one where Elias Rennick would become the story. An executive turned threat. A flight risk. Headlines would have followed. Contracts would have stalled. Aeronax's bid for international aviation control protocols would have collapsed under media scrutiny. It wasn't just surveillance. It was sabotage. He glanced at the note again. Who wrote it? A remorseful crew member? Someone embedded but not aligned with Corvin? Or a passenger who pieced it together too late? He needed answers, but more urgently, he needed to protect what remained intact. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone, opening a secure call line. The signal blinked for authorization. Then Commander Rellenvor's voice came through, sharp but steady. Elias, keep the envelope sealed. Chain of custody must be verified. Do not let internal security handle it without third-party observers. Rellen paused. What did you find? They weren't after me, Elias said slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the faces around him. They wanted to frame me. They needed me to look like a security breach. But the truth is... He looked down at the note one final time, reading the words again as the cabin crew made their final checks and the doors sealed. They didn't want to stop me. They wanted to silence what I know. Flight Valiant 6, 17, finally departed. slicing through heavy cloud cover like a blade through silk. The roar of the engines dulled into a hum, and the cabin, still tense from the events earlier, had gone nearly silent. The lights above flickered once before settling into a dim, steady glow. Elias Rennick sat upright in his seat, eyes forward, mind racing. He didn't rest his head against the seat like others around him. He didn't reach for water or adjust his watch. He was working, already building the framework in his mind. He tapped his tablet awake and began organizing the fragmented pieces of what had just occurred. The passengers' videos were now evidence. Small windows of truth scattered across different devices, each capturing another angle of the incident. Corvin's outburst, the manifest manipulation, the confrontation, the planted envelope. He hadn't even touched his briefcase since reboarding. His focus was narrower now, not on defending himself but dismantling the narrative that had nearly been forced upon him. Halfway through the flight, the cockpit door slid open. Captain Ren Dorn stepped into the aisle, a tall, square-shouldered man with streaks of gray at his temples. He looked around cautiously before approaching Elias, lowering his voice. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his tone sincere but quiet. "The crew filled me in, but I needed to see you face to face." Elias glanced up. "You have nothing to apologize for," he replied evenly, though his eyes were sharper than his words. The captain nodded, hesitating before adding, "Before boarding, Corvin came to the flight deck. Said he was delivering updated security protocol forms. Claimed we were due for a spot check on lockdown response. Something felt off. But he had the right clearance code, or at least one that passed." Elias turned toward him fully, a knot tightening in his chest. "He tried to access the cockpit?" "Yes," the captain confirmed. "Didn't succeed, but he tried." Elias looked away briefly, his thoughts realigning. That attempt, combined with the planted envelope and the forged manifest, meant the plan wasn't singular. It was layered, redundant. The contractor hadn't been trying to control a single point of failure. They were preparing for multiple ones. If one setup didn't work, another would. Elias nodded slowly. "Thank you, Captain," he said. Dorn returned to the cockpit without another word, the gravity of his confession trailing behind him like smoke. As the plane began its descent into Norvin City, Elias adjusted his seat upright and checked his briefcase. Still locked. Still untouched. But now, the implications of what had almost occurred were fully formed. He wasn't the target. Not exactly. The situation had been designed to create an illusion that he had become erratic, uncooperative, dangerous. The visual of him tied to a chair, surrounded by concerned passengers, was no accident. It was the story someone had tried to script. He reached into the inner lining of his jacket and removed a small secure drive, a prototype containing data from Aeronox's soon-to-launch aviation protocol framework. If exposed, the contents of that drive could shift international aviation standards, giving his competitors reason to interfere. But this wasn't the work of mere corporate rivalry. This had the fingerprints of something darker, more institutional, and the envelope with the unauthorized emblem, hidden in the galley, was the proof. The moment they landed, Elias was greeted not by an airline representative, but by federal investigators already briefed by Commander Relin Vore. A tall man in a long overcoat stepped forward, extending a badge. "Mr. Rennick, I'm Agent Jorel Dane. You'll be speaking with us." Without delay, Elias was escorted through the terminal's restricted pathways into the airport's command center. There, a panel of 4 male investigators waited, their expressions taut with urgency. Elias stood before them and, with methodical clarity, laid out the timeline. Every movement, every shift, every discrepancy in protocol. He presented the evidence, the altered manifest, the crew rotation override, the security breach attempt, and the emblem on the envelope. The investigators listened without interrupting, their pens scribbling notes but never fast enough to match the precision of Elias's account. As Elias spoke, a younger agent at the back of the room examined the emblem on a projection screen. His brow furrowed. "Sir, this matches the seal of a dissolved contractor," he said, turning to the others. "Nextral operatives. They were shut down 3 years ago after allegations of illegal surveillance work." Elias's gaze narrowed. Nextral. He'd heard of them, quietly, in coded briefings from private sector liaisons, but they were supposed to be long gone, dissolved, purged from rotation lists, but clearly someone had revived them. "Why now?" One agent asked. "Why target you?" Elias tapped the secure drive on the table. "Because what Aeronox is about to launch doesn't just change how systems communicate. It removes entry points for unauthorized surveillance. If this goes live, operations like Nextral can't hide anymore. Their window closes permanently." The room fell quiet, the truth dropping with the weight of a verdict. Then one of the senior investigators leaned forward. "Do you believe this was a one-time hit? Or will this escalate?" Elias looked at the sealed evidence case being zipped shut across the room. His voice was calm, but his eyes were unflinching. Steel behind glass. This was only their opening move. The encrypted device cracked open on a federal analyst's monitor with a soft chime, but the contents it revealed struck like a thunderclap. Lines of data rolled across the screen, files, communications, and travel logs, all connected to flights across the Eastern Corridor. The room stiffened as the analyst realized what it meant Corvin Braille had not been an isolated actor. He had been part of a coordinated infiltration scheme across commercial aviation, all orchestrated by a supposedly dissolved contractor known as Nextral Operatives, and Elias Rennick had been their test case. Within 48 hours, federal investigators mobilized. The findings from Flight Valiant 617 triggered an internal directive across multiple agencies, sparking an inquiry that stretched from regional hubs to national oversight councils. The effort wasn't cloaked in drama. There were no sweeping headlines, no grandstanding news anchors, but the story spread fast, carried by the clarity of facts and the unshakable testimony of passengers who witnessed a calm man tied to a chair turn the tide against an invisible network. Inside Aeronox Systems headquarters, Elias stood in the top-floor media hall. Framed by panoramic glass that overlooked Northern City's skyline, dozens of reporters sat hushed before him. The Aeronox insignia pulsed behind him on a minimalist screen, the only decoration in a room charged with silent anticipation. But Elias didn't speak about the flight. He didn't recount the zip ties, the planted envelope, or Corvin's panicked collapse. Instead, he stood tall, suit crisp, eyes steady, and presented the new aviation security protocol Aeronox had been quietly developing, a framework that, by sheer coincidence or perhaps fate, directly addressed every loophole Nextral had exploited. The technology would be licensed across multiple carriers within weeks. International interest surged before the press conference had even concluded. Behind closed doors, justice unfolded. 3 more individuals connected to forged crew logs were arrested in coordinated sweeps across 2 airports and 1 contractor's office building in Arvanport. Every detail Elias had gathered, passenger recordings, manifest anomalies, even the coded note left beneath his seat, became a link in a chain that investigators followed with precision. And yet, Elias never centered himself in the storm. Weeks later, the Aeronox boardroom transformed into a moment of quiet gratitude. Jalen Kors, Darren Vale, and a few key passengers who had spoken up aboard Flight 617 were welcomed into the headquarters. A modest ceremony was arranged, not for publicity, but for principle. Elias greeted each of them personally. Jalen stood awkwardly before him, the memory of that day still shadowing his eyes. "Mr. Rennick," he said, his voice low, I should have acted faster." "You acted when it mattered," Elias replied, his handshake firm and eyes sincere. "Most people never do." Darren, visibly nervous, stepped forward next. I wasn't brave. I froze when I should have spoken." Elias shook his head. You spoke when it could still make a difference. That's what counts. Even Commander Relinvor received a private commendation from Elias, an encrypted token granting secure access to Aeronox's Oversight Collaboration Program. Relin accepted it with a nod of respect, understanding its significance far beyond ceremonial thanks. But as the sun fell behind the skyline that evening, and the building emptied of its guests, Elias remained. His office, high above the city, was quiet. No applause, no ceremony, just the faint hum of his monitor and the slow whir of the security system resetting. He stood alone, a tall silhouette against the glass, holding the final report in his hand. The investigation was over. Nextral operatives, long believed dissolved, had been exposed for embedding surveillance agents across flights under the guise of security, but with the intent to sabotage reputations and destabilize negotiations of high-profile figures. His figure didn't waver, but his mind replayed the moment on the aircraft when his wrists had burned beneath zip ties and Corvin had whispered control into his ear. How fragile that illusion had been, how loud truth had become in the silence of dignity. He placed the report gently into the locked archive drawer and closed it with deliberate care. His reflection in the glass stared back at him. Not a victim, not a victor, but a man who had prepared for this storm long before it arrived. He looked out toward Norvin's illuminated skyline, an empire of ambition, glass, and consequence. His voice, quiet and resolute, broke the silence, the final words carrying not anger or triumph, but clarity earned through restraint. No mercy was given, only truth. They tied him down, and froze when he stood minutes later, freeing himself with quiet precision, turning every witness and every camera toward the truth. If you believe real power doesn't roar, it acts. Subscribe now, because justice delivered by calm hands shows no mercy to abuse. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, humiliation, and the powerful shift that happens when truth and authority confront discrimination. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respecting every passenger with dignity and fairness.